over to Ray, and to take over, please, Ray.
Thanks, Gord. Hi, everyone. Just checking you can hear me okay? Hello.
Loud and clear, Ray.
Okay, good. Yeah, so Ray Markham, I'm a rural GP in the village of Valmont, which is the traditional territory of the Carrier and some people. Valmont's a village of about 1,100 people, kind of near Jasper. Our population's 1,100. We have a catchment of about 6,000 people. I've been there for 20 or so years. I'm also part of the team at the Rural Coordination Centre of BC. The Rural Coordination Centre is really a group, kind of bring a rural physician perspective to improving the health of rural patients and communities. And I've been kind of involved with the Rural Coordination Centre for the last 8 or 10 years now. Gord's asked me to kind of just give a little bit of background to kind of where the whole Partnership Pentgram Plus work that we're doing, and kind of where the linked sectors fits into that whole piece of work. And so he's asked me to talk particularly about the history of the Partnership Pentgram Plus, then linked sectors and how it's differentiated from the rural citizens group, and then how input's used. I'm happy, I could talk about this for hours, so I'm going to try and keep it fairly contained, but happy to take questions or comments and kind of discuss. Also happy to chat with anyone over the phone if people need to kind of clarify anything more specific. So the funding for this work has come out of a group called the BC Academic Health Sciences Network, and through the Rural Coordination Centre, which is funded through a group called the Joint Standing Committee on Rural Issues, which is really about rural physician recruitment and retention. That's kind of fundamentally what the Joint Standing Committee does. As we've been working, kind of bringing a rural physician perspective to improving the health of rural patients and communities, it's pretty obvious that as rural physicians, we have one tiny little piece of that whole landscape. And so over the years, we've been doing work with a number of organizations, including a group out of the World Health Organization called Towards Unity for Health, which probably 20 or 30 years ago came up with this idea of the Partnership Pentgram being a model for socially accountable health education. So that's kind of where it's originated. It's actually it's adopted by all of the medical schools in Canada as a mechanism of social accountability. So the Partnership Pentgram is policymakers, so ministry, federal and provincial ministries, obviously, then health administrators, which in our context is health authorities, academia, so educators and learners, then providers, so kind of the people kind of providing care, and the people, citizens. So that's the Partnership Pentagram, which has been applied and kind of really well recognized as a mechanism of socially accountable health education. What we're talking about is how does a system evolve, and how does a system move forward? And this is where the linked sectors group has come in. So it's pretty obvious in a rural community that all of those players are important, but there is a perspective that's missing, which is the perspective of industry and nonprofits. So how does that, because that perspective firstly has a vested interest in the health of people in rural communities, whether you're in the mining industry or Chamber of Commerce or any kind of industry, having healthy people working, if you are kind of employing people in rural communities, but also there's an impact on health and an impact, a responsibility for kind of health in things like the social determinants of health and kind of partnering to kind of improve health of rural people. So that perspective has really not been in a lot of these conversations. And so over the last couple of years, we've kind of really tried to kind of move to include that perspective in. And again, there's some evidence that we're starting to produce around the value of that. This work started in kind of really tangibly in 2019. We held a summit of the 6 partners. We're calling it the Partnership Pentgram Plus, and the 6 partners in Vancouver. There's about 250 people. All of the 6 sectors were there, really just looking at, as we were moving forward, what should our primary areas of focus be? And so we had linked sectors there, we had citizens there, we had the ministry there, we had health authorities there, we had providers there, so doctors and nurses, physios, etc. We had students and learners and educators and researchers kind of there. And out of that came 4 priority areas, really. One of them was cultural safety and humility. The other one was transport. And, transport in the emergency transport piece, but also transport is in access to services. Then virtually enabled, virtually enhanced care. So how does the virtual world actually improve access to rural communities and not take over or cut back on in-person services in rural communities? And then team-based care. So those are the 4 areas that kind of were identified then. There's been a subsequent summit we held, which was really around 1,000 people participated, 57 rural communities. We had a Partnership Pentgram plus kind of table in 57 rural communities, which that was the foundation of that work. So the one in 2019 was kind of really about kind of the top kind of leadership piece. We did have obviously people who were providing service and connected to the ground, but the one in 2021 was kind of really kind of founded on the ground, on people in rural communities. So that idea of a Partnership Pentgram plus in a rural community, again linking into the system leaders, and looked at kind of refining a number of things. And I'm happy to share the reports on those groups. But this group, the linked sectors, did feed into the shaping of all of that, as well as the movement on all of that. We've seen a bunch of movement in all of these areas. So we now have in our rural emergency rooms access to an emergency room doc for any rural emergency room within seconds by video. We're pushing on the digital divide. So what about those communities that don't have access to internet? How can we kind of improve and enhance access to work in partnership with that? On the transport front, Roger had kind of advocated right from the beginning the importance of us having access to data. Actually, what are the real transport statistics? And we're actually just moving into a phase now. It's been a long journey, but into getting what are called key performance indicators. So, how when you're in a rural community, one of these edge communities, we talk about the edge communities in rural. So the smaller places. How long from when you call 911 to an ambulance pitching up at your door? How long from an ambulance pitching up at your door to kind of getting to an emergency room? How long from getting to an emergency room to getting to definitive care if you need to get to definitive care? And then how long from getting to definitive care to get back home? So actually trying to set up some of those key performance indicators. So these are some examples of some of the progress and work that's been done. And there are a number of principles that I think are super important with the Partnership Pentgram Plus as we've been implementing it. One is this idea of simultaneity. So when we talk with each other, with everybody around the table, not the ministry talking to the health authority and then going to the community and saying, well, the ministry and health authority have decided this, what do you think? But it's actually having everybody around the table. And that creates some interesting power dynamics, because you can't have dialogue with 300 people. You need to have a smaller group. So like, for instance, a transport working group needs to be a pretty small working group. We now have a virtual health and wellness collaborative for Indigenous and rural communities. So you can't have a table of 300 people kind of talking and listening to each other. You need to have a smaller group. And it's pretty easy for us to get into a place of tokenism where we have, we could say, okay, we're going to talk to any one of you and say, hey, could you bring a linked sectors perspective to that table? But when you come into a table of like 12 so people, let's say, for argument's sake, 12 people to have dialogue, and you have a couple of people from the ministry and a couple of people from health authorities and a couple of providers, the ministry has this huge machine behind it that is actually kind of funneled into those 2 people who's sitting there. The health authorities have exactly the same thing. What groups like the citizens group, honestly, the providers group, and for sure the linked sectors group don't have is that ability to actually, within their own kind of diverse kind of perspectives, actually kick around ideas and come to kind of what we call a collective perspective. And so that's actually been the nascence of creating this group, is to try and correct that kind of power imbalance in some way, to create space for a collective perspective of the linked sectors, so that when we are coming to talk to transport, there is kind of a couple of people who can come in dialogue, but bring a collective perspective. They've talked it through with some of their colleagues and peers, and they can come and say, hey, this is what we think. And even more so, start bringing to the table, not this is the topic, what do you think, but what should the topic be? And that's the place we ultimately want to get to is, where is our kind of the area of collective interest? Where is the maximal place that we should be focusing our energies? I liken it to traditionally what we've done is we've come to a problem and looked at a problem, and a few of us have come around a problem. If you imagine the problem is a big hole, and we looked at the hole, and then we start blaming each other for why the hole's there. Or what we actually even better at is we blame whoever's not there for the hole and for why we can't do anything about it. So the idea is bringing everybody there. And rather than a hole, kind of the image that is in my mind is this kind of big rock that we've decided, okay, we want to lift this rock together. And we all have different roles to play in lifting this rock. And the way that we lift this rock together, we need to actually be aware of adjusting our pacing and what we're doing according to what other people are doing. So if one person is kind of really kind of able to kind of yard on that rock, and a couple other people aren't able to move as quickly, then we need to slow down. Otherwise, the thing's just going to tip over. So that's the idea of the partnership tables, is bringing a perspective, not a representation, coming together, hearing what each other is doing, and then actually kind of starting to kind of guide each other as we kind of starting to move forward with lifting the rock. Or we use appreciative inquiry quite a lot, which is a process for kind of getting to solutions rather than kind of getting stuck in a spiral of problem solving. So that's kind of where we are, and that's kind of a little bit of the history of why this group is formed, why we've kind of tried to resource this group, is to start creating that idea of that collective perspective for the linked sectors. So the question that Gordon, everybody's asked is, well, how's that different to the citizens group? Because, I live in Valmont, it's 1,100 people. So our linked sectors may well be our Chamber of Commerce, for instance, some of the Robson Valley Support Society, which kind of provides some social services and kind of all of those kind of things. So, but all of them would say they're community members as well. And, my response to that is really twofold. One is, it's about nuance of perspective. So for sure, when the community table gets together, they're really kind of bringing the perspective of the people. I think it's important to also bring the perspective of the entities, whatever they are, industry and nonprofit entities in a rural community, because that is a nuance and important and a different perspective. And absolutely, there's overlap. So, as a rural doc in Valmont, I bring a physician perspective, but I also actually am chief of staff in the Robson Valley. So I actually bring a health authority perspective as well. And I'm also a person who accesses health services in my village. So I bring a citizen's perspective as well. But it's important when I'm kind of at these tables that I recognize that I'm just bringing the provider perspective, if that's what I'm doing. And absolutely, we can move into those other perspectives. The other reason for it is, if we're missing anything, I think in the health system at the moment, it's the people having a voice in the health system. So I'm actually totally okay with doubling down on different ways for the people to get a perspective. So I think there is kind of more of a crossover with the linked sectors and citizens group, but I actually think that's okay, because I think one of the things that is a big gap in the health system at the moment is we don't listen to the people very much. And so it's just a kind of a 2 times the community voice, if you like, ultimately kind of coming in, one time from the perspective of the people, the individuals, and one time from the perspective of the entities, which is obviously comprised of the people as well. So, and maybe that's inappropriate and crazy, and I mean, maybe we'll figure that out as we go. But I certainly have found it super helpful as we move forward, because it frees up kind of people to bring a patient kind of perspective to that, and not have to kind of move into kind of the industry nonprofit sector, and frees up the industry nonprofit sector. And then the last piece is, so what do we do with this information? I think I've given you some examples already, but I would be very interested, first of all, this is, as far as I'm aware, so I do some work at UBC Health. I'm a health systems advisor for UBC Health, and I'm not aware of anywhere else in the world that is doing this, that is bringing that is actively trying to bring in industry and nonprofits as well as citizens into kind of a Partnership Pentgram Plus framework. And the idea of socially accountable healthcare transformation is really a health system that meets the needs of the people. That's fundamentally kind of what it's about. But there is an element of social accountability also, being us as human beings, being accountable to each other as human beings when we sit around a table and say, hey, we're going to do this, or hey, we're going to do this, or whatever. So the outputs, I think are there, and happy to share any of those. You can see some of them in the report. We've made a lot of progress in all of those areas. Probably team-based care is the furthest behind at the moment, but that's largely because there's a bunch of work going on provincially. We're trying to align with what's going on provincially in that area. And so happy to share any of those things. And as I say, the end game here is to have a place where we have a legitimate collective perspective of industry and nonprofits kind of brought to the table, both shaping ideas. So like if people are interested in things like transport or team-based care, to get your perspective on that, and then to have you bring at various tables, 1 or 2 people to kind of come and bring that perspective to those tables. And then the second piece is actually starting to shape up, well, in addition, what other things do you think is important that can be brought to those tables? We have what used to be called an April Fool's group, because it met on April Fool's Day initially, but including the Deputy Minister of Health, some health authority CEOs, kind of a very high level leadership table, which kind of kicks around twice a year, kind of what are our areas of focus. And then we kind of have these working group tables as well that meet up. So I'm going to stop there. I will post my cell phone number in the chat, and I'm happy to obviously chat kind of with this group now, but also if people wanted to chat with me afterwards. And board, happy for you to share my cell phone with anybody who wants to kind of, if there's a need to clarify anything. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Ray. I mean, we know how amazingly busy you are, so certainly try not to bother you. I mean, just a couple things before I open up, see if there's any questions at all for Ray. Is that, I mean, as Ray's mentioned, sort of in when I was reaching out to each of you, I think, we all sort of understand as people that even live rurally or represent groups that have rural organizations, is that, as Ray says, I mean, the provision of healthcare is critically important to the survival of rural communities, in that we're going to lose a bunch of population if we don't have appropriate rural healthcare. From the industry perspective, it's incredibly hard to recruit people to come to rural areas to live unless they can be assured of quality healthcare. And then, as Ray says, I think that there's all these nonprofit groups that aren't a lot of times immediately recognized as direct health providers, but play a critical role in the delivery of healthcare in some ways in our communities. So having that sort of representation on this group, I think really, really helps. And the final thing I would just say is, Ray alluded, we originally met in person just before the epidemic hit. Once is the only time we've ever met in person. I think Ray was there, I was there, Roger was there, Paul was there, but that's it out of this group. We then met digitally, I think maybe 6 times over a period of about a year and a half. But several of the people had to leave the group because of job changes, retirements, moving away, other reasons. But I think the discussions we've had to date have been very wide ranging, have been very, very useful, I think, from both parties. And I'll just give one example. We spent one time talking about a program that I had never heard of before. And I, pretty involved in rural stuff, called Community Paramedic Program. So it was great because we all learned about something that most of us didn't know existed. But it was also, I think, very useful for some of the healthcare providers that were on the call to hear. We heard from one of the rural citizens that, yeah, this is a great program, but there's no plan B. We had somebody, he was well trained, and he almost immediately was poached by another group, and there was no backfilling of that person in our community. So it's those kind of things that I think the dialogue really helps, as Ray says, to go both ways. So with that, I'll just open it up to anybody. Mark?
I just wanted to offer one more perspective vis-a-vis the history and the evolution of some of the thinking so far in the conversation, and why we're trying to draw in these additional perspectives. And that is that concept of actually creating health. And Lisa mentioned it, as opposed to just focusing on the healthcare system, because as we know, analysis after analysis, saying the healthcare delivery system is only a piece of the puzzle, piece of the pie, if you will, in terms of creating health, optimal health. And many times, investors and financial institutions and employers overall and insurance companies have a lot of role to play in creating health, right? A healthy work, a healthy job, a healthy environment, housing, a stable income, all of those things probably have more to do proportionally, right? So bringing those perspectives into these pieces, because sometimes in healthcare, we get so focused and sometimes appropriately so focused on the micro, we kind of forget sometimes those bigger pieces. And so some of those conversations are making their way into healthcare delivery, where we're talking about kind of social services as well as medical services. But really the community building and the community perspective has so much more to offer in terms of creating health. So I just throw that out there as kind of a piece of the puzzle that we're often trying to be finding ways to remind ourselves that needs to be brought into the conversation and perhaps emphasized even more than ever.
Yeah, very good points, Mark. Roger?
Sometimes I like to throw the cat in with the pigeons, only because I can't help myself. I think, first of all, on the positive side, I think the areas that we spent time in, and certainly the one that brought me initially into the group around transportation, although I'd say, although we've never hit the home run, incrementally, those services have improved in different parts of BC in a way that, it gives me comfort that at some point in time, the province will be covered in a way that I think is now providing the equitable healthcare, without getting into the details of the report, which speaks to a lot of the things and speaks to some of the things that Gordon talked about around rural development. But this is one of my observations. I actually think in the last 2 years, as we've gone through COVID, as much as it's taxed the healthcare system, I think has really exposed the healthcare system. It's now really clearly demonstrated that Canada has allowed itself to get to a place where we really don't have enough beds collectively in the whole system to represent our population, and we have one of the lowest ratios. I think it's the lowest ratio of sort of a modern country. So sometimes I ask myself, was our hospital overload problem a problem that the hospitals are overloaded, or a more substantive problem that we should have had more resources to begin with, and it wouldn't have been taxed as much. But the other observation I have is that I think generally, so I spend a lot of time traveling around the province, specifically in areas like the Northeast, which is, if you look at where the economic booms are in BC, they really sit between the Site C pipeline energy side and the Kitimat LNG, the two largest capital projects in Canada that are going on. And that's where workforce development is moving, and so I spend a lot of time in those communities: Chetwynd, Dawson Creek, Fort St. John, Terrace, Kitimat, Rupert. My observation is that since COVID is that rural healthcare has gone downhill. And I think industry looks at primary healthcare as their key thing. I think people like me that choose to live in Terrace look at the holistic side of healthcare, because I actually want it to serve me primary, but also serve my other interests as I continue to age and eventually retire here. But I think for industry, their focus is, what's the primary care look like? Are our workers safe? Can we get transportation out in case there's accidents? All of those sort of things, which they will be held accountable to their constituents, which is their employees and their companies. And we are suffering across all of the province a shortage of doctors and all of those professionals. In Terrace today, you cannot get a family doctor, even if you wanted to. There's none available. So the emergency ward is now the place that everybody goes. The average waiting time, if you go in there, is probably somewhere between 5 and 7 hours, maybe longer. And people are moved through quicker, which means you're back in there quite often over and over and over again. I think we've, in this province and probably in this country, have rightly so pursued technology as a way of solving a lot of our challenges, how to bring more services into communities. And my concern and fear is that we're constantly looking for technology to solve our problems when we actually may have a much more simpler problem. It's a human resource piece that we just need more folks into those areas. And while Vancouver has all of those problems, I think when you get into rural communities, we have exactly the same problems. Homeless people in the streets, hospitals, emergency rooms that are backed up. But I think the impact, because you're not close enough to the major centers where the specialties exist to get more critical things dealt with, the impact in a rural community is greater. Because at least you may have to wait 7 hours at St. Paul's, but if it's a head trauma thing you need, there's a head guy somewhere in the system. In Terrace, Cranbrook, wherever you are, that doesn't exist. So I think our actual delivery of healthcare, probably predictable anyway, COVID was going to drive it down a bit anyway. But I think it's really been exposed. And I really think that we need to be cautious as we continue to move, that we separate where technology helps us and don't use technological advances as ways to try and solve what is really a human relations problem and an HR issue, and start to really focus our energies on building that infrastructure, human infrastructure, and putting in place some conditions. I mean, if you go to the Army and you become a doctor, you got to stay in the Army for 10 years to pay for it. Maybe we bring in healthcare, whatever we need to do to solve the HR problem. But until we can find a way that makes sure that people have a family doctor, because without it, how the hell do you get into a specialist in our system? You got to go to the emergency ward, and you got to hope, especially if most of the emergency doctors are, the locums that just come and go every 30 days, that he'll get you into the right room, because if not, you're back there later. I think our system is really exposed, and it's not falling apart, and it's not the end of the world. But I think we need to focus on what is our priorities. And my fear is, because we've always, I think for the last decade, one of the real advantages for ourselves rurally has been the introduction of technology and how we've used that to deliver more variety of services into communities and initial response and all those other things. But I think we have to come to grips with what is a real problem around our human resource and start to bolster that, and not just continue to look for technical solutions.
Great.
Yeah, Roger, brilliant comments as usual. And I actually don't think it's throwing the cat among the pigeons at all. On a couple of fronts. So certainly on the virtual side, one of the things so we talk about gravitational pull in the system. So the inequities that you talked about are produced because the system is perfectly designed to produce the inequities it produces. And so there is this gravitational pull of things. When you get into a resource constrained environment, things pull into the bigger centers where you have critical mass, where you have more supports and all of that kind of stuff. So I think what you talked about is a perfect example of as the tide's coming in with human resources, where you're going to see it worst is at the edges, in those rural communities. And so I've been in Belmont 20 years, and I've never seen the number of diversions in rural emergency rooms than we're seeing over the last 6 months. And that's because people have been stretched, but they've just managed to hold things together. And now they're just not holding things together anymore. So I think, on that front, also on the technology front, our involvement in technology has always been to make sure that technology is used appropriately, exactly as you say, to support in community services, not to take the place of or kind of erode in community services. It could very easily happen. You could see virtual care being seen as a cheaper option to supporting docs, or a less politically hot potato option to making docs or nurses, whatever, go to rural communities. So that's one piece. And the second piece is, one of the functions I think of this group is, if you feel that what you talked about is important, is to start bubbling that up, because I totally agree with you. I think this is where we're moving. We talked about things 2019, we're now in 2022. And I think this is a very much kind of coming front and center for everybody, is actually bums on seats in healthcare, really. And also a part of that is, how do we go upstream to prevent people getting into the health system appropriately? How do we work in teams to make sure that people have access to the right person? And those teams include the head guy. How do we make sure we bring the head guy in when the head guy needs to be brought in kind of easily, and kind of in a way that's kind of appropriate and fair for communities? But if this group were to say, hey, we think this human resources piece is an important piece that we need to start paying attention to, that is again super helpful. And I think you'll see a lot of kind of receptivity kind of from the other partners on that as well.
Great points. Lisa, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I totally agree with Roger, what you've said, and Ray, you've said in terms of a resource issue. And, there's obvious resource issues in the health sector. We see reports all the time of how many people are going to exit even the healthcare sector as a result of the strain of COVID, which is only going to put more strain on it. But even across, other businesses and even our business ourselves, we are, since COVID, the labor market is horrendous in terms of being able to, attract talent. And that goes from frontline jobs right up into the specialties. So this is a broad-based issue, probably more predominant in health because of the skills and the competencies that are needed. So I do think it is a focus. And I had one other question, which is the output of this group, or the bringing this group together. Again, I'm always trying to understand, if we were to come forward with thoughts, recommendations, or actions, who are we sending it to, and what's the governance of this, so that we can ensure that there is some action or funding or whatever is needed? How do we advocate for that?
Yeah, Lisa, great point. So I'm gonna. So the bottom line to that is, actually this group has people who actually sit on various tables. So the April Fools group, the kind of provincial partnership table on rural, the transport table, the Virtual Health and Wellness Collaborative. There's work going on around cultural safety and humility led by First Nations Health Authority, and team-based care. And, I think the team-based care conversation is going to really evolve in the direction that you and Roger are talking about. Is part of team-based care is you need to have a team. And part of that, in rural site, that team needs to actually be in the community to some degree. You can't have a cath lab, a cardiac cath lab in every community, but you should have a certain number of people actually supported to be in community. So there will be these tables, but we're in a complex adaptive system, and so we're dealing in complexity. And so I'm going to encourage us to think not of this as an organization, because we're not an organization. We actually don't, but more in this idea of networks and network theory, because networks actually are really the place that actually, the way that I think in a complex adaptive system, you shift things around. So a network is kind of made up of, you see a network through a common purpose. This would be about improving rural health. And I agree, it's healthcare and health and wellness. And then you have nodes, which are entities within a network, and a relationship, feedback loops, communication between those entities. That's essentially what makes up a network. And so I would kind of encourage us to see this as a part of a network around improving the health of rural patients and communities. So the idea of this group having connections, relationships with kind of tables that are working in areas of interest, and also connections and relationships with your peers and colleagues, which are more than the dozen or so people sitting at this table. So it's kind of almost you're almost a conduit, if you like, in that way. And so then the accountability piece would really be kind of you bringing the linked sectors perspective to those various tables. You also kind of ultimately seeing kind of the shift and movement that you're going to be seeing, but there's the role of this group is not going to be to tell anybody you have to do this. And then if this group says we've minuted, this needs to change, it's not like you're the board of the health system that actually, or even the partnership table is not the board of the health system. We have structures that already are there with their own governance models. The idea is actually influence and dialogue and curiosity. That's what we're trying to produce, which I believe firmly that's actually the way that things change. We all know culture eats strategy for breakfast. And at the end of the day, things, you can have policy, you can have money, you can have a governance kind of structure to push something forward, and it does not go. And why doesn't it go? There are a whole bunch of different reasons for it. Or you could also actually push and move things forward without those pieces. And I know in a corporate world, that's sometimes a kind of a different way of thinking about things. But really, fundamentally, that's what we're trying to do is actually kind of build relationship, build dialogue, build listening, so that actually the linked sector's voice is actually a part of the conversation. And then also the linked sectors would kind of in whatever context be putting their shoulder to the plow along with everybody else, if within their own governance structures, they agree that this is the priority and they're going to move forward with. I don't know if that answers the question, Lisa.
I think so. And it's actually, given me some other things to think about, and again, going back to the issue of resources. And I noticed we don't have anyone from the regulatory regime in here. And is there any value in trying to add a participant, maybe from the health regulators, to start to look at, if we're really looking at, and I have to assume team-based care, even though you've got your specialties, we're often seeing, changes in scopes of practice of various healthcare providers to be able to do more things for those in the community. And I'm just wondering, again, they have a different thought process and different, influencing. And I'm just wondering if there is some opportunity to think about that now, especially with the Health Professions Act being modernized this fall, and the whole college structure could provide some valuable thought process to us as a group as well. What potentially could help. And, if I look at, the North Star of this group is if our North Star is to improve that rural care, and, anything that we can do to influence and advocate for it goes to that. I think, the regulatory piece is something we shouldn't forget about.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you could make the argument that the regulatory perspective is a linked sectors perspective or a policy perspective, but I think I totally agree with you. The other thing that's super interesting in rural is actually there's a lot of talk about healthcare provision being done through regulated health providers. But what about those who are non-regulated?
Mm-hmm.
There's a massive amount in rural communities of healthcare delivery of the home community care workers, the traditional healers, that's a kind of another layer on that whole conversation for sure.
Yeah, and I would hope that as they're modernizing our health regulatory regime, that they start to look at those non-regulated and create a voice and a channel for it. And from a private insurance perspective, I'm more than willing to advocate and share information, with thoughts of this group to help improve it, to see if with whatever actions that we think we want to push forward. And I'd love to learn more about team-based care, because I often find team-based care, I think, actually help people when you are getting the right team, and especially, I'll say even the right, and sometimes it's multiple people talking to that same patient to get that care, because I don't think we can sometimes rely on the patients to share the right information from healthcare provider to healthcare provider, and that can cause challenges as well. And we've been on a electronic health journey or electronic medical record journey, and the privacy and the access. And so what I'm trying to say here, as well as the health regulatory, I think we also need to think about making sure we don't have any constraints in the regulatory environment, privacy maybe being one of them, that could prohibit, the goal of improving rural health.
Yeah, totally agree. We actually, through this work, have started some work on a rural personal health record, where actually the information is kind of given under the control, and the source of truth is actually with the patient. They can actually say you can have access, because most of the people in the system expect that actually everybody they see has access. And the other interesting thing around the team is groups like this perspective on it would be super helpful, because in the health system we tend to see the team from the provider perspective or from the health authority perspective, but not from the patient perspective. Who is your team? We build a team saying, okay, well, we have a primary care team, for instance. but actually that's somewhat meaningless to people, because for sure they're primary care people in their team, but there maybe are specialized services, or wound care or ostomy care or whatever, and specialists, they all need to be part of the team. And so you have a primary care team, then you have an ostomy team, then you have a wound care team, and then you have a neurology team. That doesn't make sense from the patient. They can have 4 teams who don't talk to each other, kind of thing. So bringing it down to the perspective of the team needs to be defined by the patient, from the patient perspective. You know, the last piece I'll kind of say on the accountability piece is, I think it's totally appropriate to judge this work by its track record. And I can say that, I mean, as Roger's alluded to, we've seen change. It's not the magic bullet for sure, but there's incremental change that is directly attributable to this work, shifting things that, you know, like Roger, I have a passion for transport. When I started this work at the Royal Coordination Centre of BC, I was asked by the guy who I took over from, what is the one thing I'd like to see change? And this is a guy who's changed a lot of big things in the system. And I said transport, and he said pick something else that's too difficult. But we're actually seeing things move in a way, and the same thing with virtual services and whatever. So happy to share any of those, but there are very tangible things that are happening as a result of us kind of focusing our collective energy on things. And so that's ultimately the accountability I think that we need to be looking for. Is not does somebody say yes, we're going to do that, but actually do things change? And attribution, I think, in a complex adaptive system is going to be more difficult. So are we going to be able to say attribute it to, oh, because of this person saying this thing changed? Probably not, because there have been multiple people doing different things to make the one thing change. But seeing the things that we want to change is actually, I think, the ultimate form of accountability, that we should be all, you know, we don't want to be sitting and talking and actually for the sake of talking, and the world stays the same. So.
Exactly. Thanks so much. I was just wondering, Leanne and Naomi, if I might ask you, following up, as Lisa said, I think that this labor shortage is happening everywhere, both in urban and rural. But I'm just wondering, Leanne, like, have you noticed for an organization that is, quite frankly, probably a major employer in several of the small rural communities, the credit union services, are you finding it difficult to recruit staff? And is there an issue because of rural healthcare?
Yeah, absolutely becoming a bigger issue, recruitment, attraction, particularly in more senior level roles. In fact, we're just finishing up a recruitment process for a new CEO. And we've tried to recruit a number of senior roles, I would say, over the past 6 months, where it is becoming more difficult. And I would say the question of healthcare is coming up more often than I've heard it in the past. And that is a factor that individuals are considering when they're looking to relocate, particularly from a larger urban area to a more rural community. It's absolutely becoming a bigger question. And so I can't say, that's been a factor that's caused someone not to accept a role, but it's certainly a question that's coming up more often. Absolutely.
Imagine. Thanks. Naomi, I mean, as Roger had said, you're, Chetwynd, it seems to me, as, the boom and bust of the mining, the forestry, now the energy. How
Absolutely.
are you finding it?
We're finding it good. Here at the chamber, we're only a one-person show. That would be me. So I'm not worried about, employment challenges for my office, because I just do it all. I do it all anyways. But I know within our community, it's a huge challenge. We have almost every single one of our businesses is having an issue with recruiting and retaining employees and workers. And we have lots of stuff going on here in Chetwynd. We have new builds happening. We have a new gas station with a couple of restaurants that are opening. We just had a brand new restaurant open. The brand new restaurant is already on reduced hours because they don't have any staff. So we held a job fair 2 years over the pandemic. We couldn't, but we held our job fair. We did it in person, and I had employers that would usually come and set up at the job fair, but they couldn't because they didn't have any employees to take over the time because they were working. So we have so much going on, and it's we actually had our long-term care facility, Sorreras Place here, recently lost their chef. She got poached to another restaurant. They scooped her as a new employee, but they've been advertising, and the only application they've had is from a girl in grade 10 at the high school who has cooked for her family. And this is for our extended care. So things are really, really tough. And I mean, I get phone calls here all the time regarding information from our community. And one of the questions that always comes up is, you know, what's the hospital like? What's the healthcare like? Can I get a doctor? And I just actually experienced our healthcare system here to the full extent, as I had something happen and I had to be medevaced out. And while I was in the hospital, our hospital had to close. They couldn't accept any other patients, which is quite the regular. At one point last fall, in the course of 2 months, it was closed. Our emergency room was closed more than 20, I think I counted 27 times.
Wow.
That is the struggle we have. So when you show up at the hospital, you either have to go to Fort St. John or Dawson Creek. It's not okay. It's better to do that in the summer than the winter. There's so many issues, but that is one of the biggest questions. And it's really tough to answer people who are wanting to move to our community. And that has a direct effect on our businesses. You know, you have a business owner who wants to come and invest in our community, move his family here, but there's no healthcare. They're not going to come. So it's definitely a challenge, and one that we hear about a lot, for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine. I was just going to mention too that unfortunately, a couple of the people, I invited some people from BC Hydro that couldn't make it, unfortunately, and also from the Community Health Network and Community Health Center perspective. But just quickly, also, because I was hoping we could hear a bit from Pablita and Mark, you know, I think that Mark sort of alluded to this thing of, you know, that also how important it is to keep in mind of sort of the entire spectrum, right? From the beginning of just trying to keep people well and out of the system completely to Pablito, part of my interest was with the hospices, of course, with rural communities, it's a much older demographic, old baby boomers like me. You know, and again, yeah, as we all talk about personal perspective, having lost a couple of family members in communities that didn't have hospice, and you know, the strain it put. So they were in a hospital, which was not was not, in my mind, the best place for them to be, but it was the only place because of a lack of hospice. And I just think I do know from the rural communities I work in, there's huge interest in seeing more hospice and expansion of hospice care as a more appropriate. So, Pablita, was there anything you wanted to say? And then I know Mark's done a bit of work in this area as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that, Gordon. It's interesting when we have these conversations about, you know, what really serves a community. Is it more of a brick and mortar, or is it more of a community team-based effect of health? And I think in hospice, definitely in the hospice palliative care industry, we're really looking at more of an upstream model of care, keeping people out of the health system. So when we look at our hospices in BC, there's about 72 of them. 80% of our hospices are community hospices. They serve people in the community where they need to be served. And the 13 hospices that we have that are like brick and mortar, they do the palliative approach to care, pain management, and all that. Believe it or not, they tend to not always be full because there's a lack of awareness of the accessibility of hospice care in our province. And I think that is really based on, you know, first line, like clinicians, GPs, just not really understanding who can access palliative care, when palliative care can be introduced. So really on an association level, we're really advocating for people to be supported in their homes. So we really look at the team based programming. And I think with hospice care, we're kind of in that sweet spot where there is the health, the palliative component, but there's the social component. And that's the majority of the component in BC. So really, you know, having people at home, supporting them with education, training, family caregiver supports is the big piece. That's where we see hospice care in general going, but also to really serve the rural and remote communities, because it is, so just to kind of give you an idea, to have a 10-bed hospice, the population would need to be at close to 150,000 for it to be feasible. Now that I'm being very conservative, really 200,000 would be the sweet spot. But so when we look at just that share thought process and, having to build a hospice and it's about at minimum 3 to 4 million a year to run and about 20 million to build. It's just not feasible. So looking at home supports and supporting those at home is really where we are advocating for the government to really put resources in and building from that. And I think COVID has really allowed us to look at that really wholeheartedly, because when we were isolated and not able to go anywhere, home supports, that be virtual, that be over the phone, letter writing became a thing. I think those are important to really consider. So this is where we're really hoping to kind of to focus on. It's the team, interprofessional community support. Volunteers are huge in hospice care, so we tend to try to. They're more so important to us than the workforce, believe it or not. To us, our volunteers are who we want to attract and train, and they're skilled. So it's a very different model, but hospices have been doing it for 40 plus years. It's worked. We just need to shift in a way that we can support people more, so that we're helping them.
Yeah, great points, Pablita. Because as you say, I mean, I think any of the home care health supports, not just hospice palliative, but as you say, I mean, really rely on volunteers so much in rural communities. Mark, from your perspective, did you want to add anything on some of the work you guys have been doing on palliative care?
Yeah, well, not so much palliative care. Pablita said it very well. But building on this community building. So if we think about this idea that we can all kind of tune into, is whether it's the trauma and the helicopter and the ambulance and all that stuff. When you take a bird's eye view of 30,000 foot of the health system, 80-90% is just routine, run-of-the-mill, ongoing health maintenance and support. And to Lisa's point about regulators, the bigger, there's a feature behind that concept, and that is this rise of really interesting possibilities that I think actually rural communities have, in some ways, even a better hold in trying to expand that. That is, so for example, we're having lots of experiences and exposures to the concept of health coaches. We're having a lot of exposure to the concept of peer support. In mental health, for example, peer support is growing dramatically, and it's proving to be a very, very important part of the system. So yes, access to a psychiatrist or social worker and so on is a really, really big problem, has been in this province. But peer support provides a huge element to this ongoing support of a chronic illness. And Pablita didn't mention it, but the rise of doulas, for example, in a whole bunch of other parts of the system, including palliative care, is kind of a thing now. So there's these alternative providers that are sometimes paid providers, there's volunteers, and of course there's family supports, and providing supports to families so they can facilitate. And this is very, very true in chronic disease prevention, chronic disease management, right? So this whole idea of kind of, yes, I can't get to the doctor. Well, what do you want to get to the doctor? Well, I've been having these problems with my gut, my digestion. And that still is a really important kind of connection to the doc. But a lot of the supports may actually be in community. And so again, we kind of know it's there, like AA, everybody knows about AA. It's probably one of the biggest and most successful concepts of some healthcare delivery for alcoholics. But those pieces of the puzzle are really community-based. And I think employers and community organizations can play a role in facilitating and supporting that. And you see this in, say, the financial institutions that do a really good job of engaging their employees to be volunteers in some way, shape, or form, whether it's just working at the local event in the park, or it's a broader concept of volunteerism. And so that piece of it, I just want to throw it out there as kind of one of the elements of development that rural communities and the entities that support it can play a significant role. And there's, again, emerging opportunities. And that create at least one more avenue to support health and wellness.
Great points, Mark. Paul, sorry, you've been really, really quiet. I'm just thinking, like, from your work with URCCBC, I mean, I know you've been exposed to a lot of the other consultations that Ray was mentioning, a lot of the community consultations. Anything else on sort of rural health that you think we haven't yet touched on that is important?
Just one thing I was reflecting on is some research that someone we collaborate with quite frequently, Jude Cornelson, did out of the Center for Rural Health Research at UBC, looking at patient attitude and willingness to travel from urban to rural for surgical care, where she found that patients from cities were quite willing to travel to smaller sites to receive high quality surgical care. And we know through some of her other research that the surgical care received in smaller sites is just as good as the surgical care you get in smaller sites, or whichever way around I started that sentence. And I'm just also reflecting on a story I've heard of Nadine Caron, who's a wonderful subspecialist who resides in Prince George, being made to defend her choice in front of her colleagues at a conference, who were saying, with your skills and training, you should be setting up in Vancouver. And she said to them, it's the same distance from Vancouver to Prince George as the distance from Prince George to Vancouver. And so when we have discussions about resources and centralization and all of that, our focus is always on we always provide the service in the center, and we don't, and then we catch as catch can in the smaller areas. And I think if we take that 30,000 foot view, like Mark is saying, it's viewed in isolation. It's hard to come up with funding for something in order to serve a specific community if that specific community is too small. But if we take a systems view, there are other approaches that we can use to try and build services with an appropriate population base. They don't always have to be based in Kamloops or Kelowna or Vancouver. They could be based in other places, and a little creativity on this, I think, goes a long way. And we are starting to get research like Jude's research that shows that patients are willing to travel for service when that service is being provided in a place different from where they live. We expect it of people who live in rural, and we shouldn't preclude expecting it from people who live in the city as well.
Yeah, very good points, Paul. As you're saying, making sure that we're maximizing the efficiency of the infrastructure we do have. Is that I remember I lived in Prince George for a number of years, and there was a case where a surgeon didn't have enough hours access to the OR in Prince George, but he asked hospital surgery privileges in Vanderhoof, which is an hour down the road. So you had your option. You could wait longer and have it done in Prince George, or you could go down. And for day surgery, it really made sense, right? And it helped better utilize those OR rooms and the time. I'm conscious of the time because I promised everybody that we wouldn't be much more than an hour and 15 minutes or an hour and a half. I also don't want to cut off the conversation, though. A couple things. I mean, as my plea to you guys initially when I contacted you all is, I really hope that you will consider staying on this group. My promise to you is that, normally we would keep the Zoom calls to an hour and a half at the very most. As Ray alluded to, I mean, my sense is sometimes what happens is through the RCCBC, they will say, hey, there's some work being done. They would like to get some feedback from the Linked Sectors group. So we have a presentation from somebody who's working on something, and then we provide a bit of feedback. There's also the opportunity, as Ray says, is that if we identify amongst ourselves a certain topic we'd really like to discuss, then I can work on either tracking down somebody to help us give a presentation on that and talking about it a bit more. So, for example, and what I'm thinking of is that, we were hoping maybe 6 meetings between September and say the end of next June. could I just ask quickly, and if people could let me know by email if they are hopefully willing to continue on with this group. It will be quite a bit bigger next time. We'll add another 5 or 6 people that weren't able to make today. But yeah, it's just your willingness to continue on. The other thing is, maybe we could just take a couple minutes here to discuss it, is my thought is, I know all of you are very, very busy with lots of other stuff, including your day jobs. My thought is typically, I think it's usually better for folks if we do it sort of early morning, 9 to 10, 10:15, or at the end of the day, 3:30 to 4:30, so that it doesn't screw up the rest of your day. Does that sound about right? Okay. And then I would also, we would send out a doodle poll and try to pick dates and times that work most for people. Another thing that Mark and I have talked a bit about is saying, that no matter when we hold the meetings, there will be times just like today where people simply can't make it, but maybe have an interest in part of the discussion is that through Sarah and the center, certainly that there's, instead of just your normal little chat line, there are things like thought exchange and that are useful sort of digital tools. If people wanted to, if we had a topic that people really did want amongst this group talk a bit more about, that's relatively easy to people to feed into that and to have an offline discussion as well in between our Zoom meetings. So, yeah. Ray? And
yeah, good. Yeah, maybe just to throw it out there is, as the group has evolved, we've had this conversation before, but we'll kind of bring it up to this group again, as well as, supporting your time to kind of participate in this work is important. And it's a conversation we have with all of these collective perspective groups. And there's an equity piece to this as well. So, paying an hourly rate or something like that doesn't make sense. Sometimes people would see this work as a part of their day job. And so linked into that, one of the things that we have kind of set up with other groups, and is a possibility for this group, is an honorarium of some sort, to kind of just recognize, again, not look at paying, because an hourly rate kind of in our current system, an hourly rate of a CEO is different to an hourly rate of kind of somebody else kind of in another part of the system. And so we don't want to pay people different rates for kind of different things. So that's, I'm just going to throw it out there, kind of awkward as it is, for this group to consider and to think about, and would welcome feedback as, hey, this is part of my day job, or, an honorarium it would be appropriate, kind of, or whatever. Those are, I think, 2 options that we would be willing to put on the table. It's just a way of acknowledging the importance of your time and the fact that you're doing other things with your time. And so kind of just want to put it out there, again, it comes back to the inequity. If you're in the ministry and you have these conversations in the ministry, you're paid to have a conversation. That's part of your job. But for us to expect kind of people to come together on an equal playing field, at least how can we level the playing field out a little bit? So I'm just going to throw that out there for your consideration and for kind of feedback, and welcome your feedback on that.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ray. Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think the other thing is that, Mark and I discussed a bit, is that with employment groups, and I reached out, typically I had to go to either the larger employers who have enough paid staff, that like BC Hydro or someone that might be able to assign somebody, or organizations that represent business interests. So Leanne was kind enough from the credit union to join us for this call, and hopefully can do the same. And then Naomi from the chamber, because I think a lot of times at the mid to smaller scale businesses, as Naomi says, we have business owners who can't get enough staff, so they're spending all their time actually running their business. So they simply don't have the time to participate in something like this. So we need their to try to get the voice of their association to help cover off some of that employer perspective. Anything else sort of in closing remarks that people would like to talk a bit more about?
And just, and maybe for a topic for a future meeting, because it's very interesting seeing the dynamics and the various backgrounds of everyone, and the thought leadership that they can bring to this topic. And one of the things that, the primary care, and then what I would call the what's covered in private health benefits. And, similar in the private health benefit business, I actually see our insurance products being probably developed and focused more on those that are in the urban settings. And maybe there's some thought, and we could have a conversation of what is important to rural employers and businesses in terms of importance of private healthcare benefit offerings that could and should be automatically designed into a program. And I'm already, just with the talk around here, and I know we cover a medical transportation benefit as an example. It's not very well utilized, but we cover things like that. Expanding care, and again, if we're allowed to do so in our regulatory framework, but nurse practitioners, other healthcare provider groups that would not normally treat. Mark talked about the networking. Even the family network of caring for someone. What kind of things could we do that would provide supports to the communities that could then enable those communities to help care and improve the care and well-being of people in the community? So not for today, but maybe, at some point in the future, after we get maybe a little bit more background information, I would be very interested in it. And I'd be even, happy to bring in, some people from our product area to say, what could we do to design it, and what would that, it takes some time, but it's just a thought.
Yeah, no, very
Is
interesting.
that I love that. I think I second that 100%. I think when we look at community supports and like I talked about how hospices do the teeter-totter both in the health and the community, that's been discussions in terms of, what does coverage look like when someone chooses to have home support compared to in the hospital or in a clinic. And I think there are barriers that come from accessing care because of that. So I think this is a great topic, and I would be extremely supportive of having that discussion for sure.
Yeah, be a fascinating discussion, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Can I also ask, just because it's something recently I participated in 2 or 3 months ago, is for the September meeting, just because I know I could get a presenter, I think relatively easy, is I think Ray mentioned it a bit. There is a lot of work going on right now around personal healthcare records being tied for the patient to have access. Would folks be interested in spending maybe an hour sort of hearing how far that is along and sort of the issues? As Lisa had mentioned, I think there's this whole thing of, if you have so many people feeding in at some point, potentially feeding into that health record, and then how do you maintain the privacy and the security of it? And yet, for those of us who've moved around a lot, know how extremely valuable something like that would be for us. So.
I'd
Yes.
welcome a conversation in that area. And I know it's something we look at all the time, again, from a private health perspective. And consent is so important, but again, thoughts and advocacy for how can we make it simple for patients and people to know who they've got to provide consent to and for what purpose. And that, to me, is one of, I think, the biggest challenges. Like, I would be happy to give consent once, for a whole range of things about a certain topic. Like, I'm okay for any healthcare professional to access anything about my record without me having to sign consent at every single healthcare provider I go to. So I'm going to say I'd love to talk about that and models that we could advocate for and try and influence.
Oh, great.
Maybe I shouldn't be saying that working for a private benefits company, but I'm just speaking personally.
Well, I agree with you, Lisa. I'm thinking that I have no problem with the health authority or my doctor knowing as much about me as Facebook already does. So
yeah, exactly.
Closing thoughts, Leanne, do you have any?
Sorry. Yeah, I think my first thought is that I have a lot to learn. And this is all very interesting and starting to put some of the pieces together. Really interested in continuing the conversation around, how someone in a role like mine and an organization like ours can have some influence and some input and support, the initiatives that everyone's talking about here. So I'm happy to continue being a part of this discussion. Absolutely.
Oh, thanks so much, Leanne. Appreciate it. Pablita, any sort of final thoughts?
I was actually just putting it in the chat there, so I'll just.
I should look.
I think this group is great. I am very supportive of networking groups. I will say I'm a little bit more of, if I have two topics that I know we're coming and having some thorough discussions with, so I can, do some pre-work and bring. I do like that model if that is something that people are interested in, just to kind of keep us focused in our discussion at hand, because I can go on a tangent. In saying that as well, I don't know if there's been any consideration in inviting the Métis Nations. I know that there's work with the First Nations Health Authority, but the Métis Nation is a very close partner of ours, and their funding model, their healthcare model, their coverage is completely different. And I think this would be a group that would appreciate the representation at this table.
Oh, good point. Would you mind offline, Pablita, if you can think of anybody I might be able to approach? If you can send me an email, that'd be great.
Beautiful, thanks.
Thank you. Roger?
Yeah, I have a hard stop here, so I have to go in a second. So after this is almost like we're starting from scratch again, because there's been such a big gap. I think what would be, and today's conversation has been, it's always good, but maybe to the last comment, I think we do need to bring some structure and organization into what we want to talk, and priority to what we want to talk about. My suggestion would be that our next meeting, no matter who's in the group, is that we start to put together the list of things, whether it's getting a presentation on medical records or something else together. Or if there's something specifically that, the rural group that you're focusing on already, you and Ray and the rest, that should be, that you want to advocate, and you need this group to help you get to the finish line. Whether it's my number one priority or not, it's irrelevant. I think it's really important that we're all sort of in the same canoe, going in the same direction. And at some point in time, we'll be in my canoe. And, but I do think we need organization and a little bit of structure to that, or else these will just be wonderful 2-hour conversations around things that we don't get to the finish line, or at least start the process of getting to the end of the beginning. So I'd be suggesting that the next meeting, whoever you have on this game, that we somehow structure it around identifying our sort of priority list, of which we each may have some, and might surprise each other how we may be advocating for somebody else on the picture screen here, not for our own vested interests.
Yeah, very good point, Roger. Thanks very much. In fact, I'll do that through the email, if you don't mind. Yeah.
I have to go, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Roger. Take care. Naomi?
Yeah, I mean, this definitely, rural healthcare is something that's, important personally to me, just because of where we're located and where we reside in the province. And as well for our members. I've always made the argument, like I said earlier, that chambers of commerce should be, I think, more involved in their community healthcare in the system, and when it comes to recruitment of nurses, doctors, et cetera, and making sure that care is there. Like I said, it's all a big circle, and having people come to your communities and have businesses and start roots in communities and just be here. And I think I really do think it's a connected thing. So that's something I've been working on since I came into this position I'm going on my 6th year now, is the importance of the connection between your local business community and your local healthcare within your communities and your regions. So I'm hoping, that maybe this will be a great start and will lead to something even better. I think it's fantastic.
Oh, great. Well, thank you, Naomi. And maybe I'll let Ray and Mark have the last word here before we turn off. I'm not sure. Mark, do you want to go first, and then we'll let Ray wrap us up and take us out of here?
I like the idea of characterizing the many topics we could be talking about, and I like the idea of trying to prioritize those and bring them. But Naomi's point just now, re-encourages me of the importance of kind of the potential value add of those organizations that have that feet on the ground in terms of what's going on and how they interject, relate to healthcare delivery. So that would be an example of a kind of the root of a bigger conversation, is saying, well, where are chambers of commerce in a bunch of communities, and can we connect differently? And as an example, or the financial service industry or the insurance industry, right? They're all kind of permutations, but as Lisa mentioned, the insurance products may not be customized enough to kind of deal with. So there's right in those last few comments, I think there's some real good roots for potential to add to that list and pursue it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Mark. And Ray.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. Really appreciate being kind of part of the group and listening. I think a lot of very interesting potential topics, and I think for sure the opportunity for this group to prioritize from your perspective, and then also the offer that may be kicking around some of these ideas at this table, but also to bring them up to kind of the provincial tables as well, where you can actually get some of the other partners' perspectives on some of those things as well. I think is another kind of invitation that I'd put out to this group. If you feel there's an area of interest, like for instance, I don't know, whatever is a consent to the private insurance or the health workforce piece, that you would like to hear the other group's perspectives on kind of the opportunity for you to float that to that level as well, is there. So I appreciate being involved. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Ray. I really appreciate it. I know you're juggling a lot. So yeah, thanks everybody very much. Like I say, I'll be in contact via email, and we'll send out a doodle poll before the end of June to try to see if we can select a time that works for folks in September. And like I say, if people don't mind, maybe I will go with the personal health records if I can find that presenter. And then as Pablita mentioned, and several others, Roger, we'll try to identify ahead of time topics so people know what it is. And if they can't participate, we'll try to find another way through Thought Exchange or some other way for people to make their comments if they can't participate in the Zoom call. So thank you all very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And everybody take care of yourselves.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Nice meeting everyone.
Thank you.